Chapter 6. If Tegan had thought the excavating was boring, she was now looking back on it as a time of excitement and intellectual stimulation. Since solving the Siren riddle and being half torn apart by the hurricane of what the doctor described as a psychic typhoon, the archaeologists had settled into a well-rehearsed schedule. The wind had died down after several minutes. They had rushed to Simmons's aid, but it was too late to help him. Tegan had tried to comfort Margaret Evans, while Atkins and the Egyptian Nebka laid out Simmons in one of the tents where the supplies were stored. The dry desert air would preserve the body for the time being, just as its preserving properties had given the ancient Egyptians the first clues about the possibilities of mummification. Once the archaeology started in earnest, the doctor was in his element. He rushed from each archaeologist to the next, checking their notes and reviewing their sketches and catalogues. He helped with measurements and suggested theories. He carried relics and copied down hieroglyphics. Tegan, by contrast, was bored out of her brain, and she wasted no opportunity to tell him this. "Can't we just take Nyssa and leave?" she asked him as they examined the tomb chamber yet again. Leave? It seemed as though the thought had not occurred to him before. The doctor continued to sketch a copy of the hieroglyphics, which covered a whole wall of the tomb, into a notebook. Tegan watched him for a while. She had initially tried to relieve her boredom by sketching scenes of the excavations, but her interest in expanses of sand, makeshift wooden scaffolding, and stone-floored rooms had foundered after a morning. "Yes, leave," she said eventually, "as in push off and leave them to it." "But we didn't," the doctor pointed out. "Did we?" "You mean we can't?" The doctor closed the notebook, pushed his pencil down the gap between the binding and the spine, and stuck it in his jacket pocket. "Probably not. But think about it, Tegan. We know one future set of events, or part of one anyway, in which we stay with the expedition, and at the end of it, Nyssa is alive. But if we leave now, we don't know what will happen." Tegan turned away. "I get the picture." The doctor's hand clapped down on her shoulder. "So, why not enjoy it while you can?" "You're joking. A load of crumbling brickwork." "It's stone, and it's not crumbling, Tegan." The doctor's voice betrayed a hint of exasperation. "The pyramids are the oldest and the last surviving of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Each pyramid, including this one so far as I can tell, is exactly aligned along the points of the compass. The base of each is a perfect square. There is not enough space between the stone blocks in the Great Pyramid to insert a razor blade. But if you took those stone blocks and used them to build a wall a foot high and a foot wide, it would stretch 2/3 of the way round the equator." "So, they're impressive." "Awesome." "Great. I'm impressed and overawed," Tegan told him. "And now I want to take Nyssa and leave." "So do I," the doctor said quietly. "So do I." They waited in silence for a while, standing beside the casket that contained their sleeping friend. It was against one wall of the large room. The wall itself was adorned with row after row of hieroglyphics. Above the level of the casket on its raised dais, a shelf ran the length of the wall. On it, labelled and ready to be packed for shipping with the other relics, stood several items. There was a wide, heavy bracelet made of thick metal. The lower half was semicircular, while the top was flattened into less of a curve. Across the top was a carved beetle of brilliant blue stone. Beside the bracelet, a ring with a large blue stone set in it rested on a small cushion of dusty, faded red velvet. Further along, a wooden cobra reared up from its coiled base, throwing a huge shadow of itself onto the wall behind. Further along the shelf was a statue of what looked like a black dog. It was about 8 inches long, paws facing forward as it sat upright. Its collar, eyes, and tall pointed ears were picked out in gold. Its tail was curled back along its body. "That's interesting," the doctor said as he looked along the shelf. "What, the dog?" "Dog? More like a jackal. That's Anubis, king of the dead, watching over his own, no doubt." The doctor pointed at the other relics. "No, I meant the spacing. The bracelet, ring, and snake are evenly spaced. Then there's a gap of over twice the size before the statue of Anubis." "Interesting. Why?" "The Egyptians, like their Osirian mentors, were into measurements in a big way. Exact measurements." "Like the pyramids?" "Yes. The topography and geometry of the pyramids is phenomenal." The doctor was examining the shelf closely, peering at the gap between cobra and jackal. "This chamber, for instance, like the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, is at a point in the structure where if you extended the floor to the outside walls, then took the perfect pyramid rising above that plane, you would have one precisely half the size of the original." "Why? Why did they bother?" The doctor was now examining a particular part of the shelf's surface. "Oh, it's all to do with power relays and receptor configuration. Boringly exact. Elegantly convoluted. Typical of Osirian technology. Take those shafts, for example." He waved a hand vaguely at the sloping wall where Tegan had watched Macready, Kenilworth, and Evans the previous day measuring a square hole. "They're just ventilation shafts," she said, repeating what Atkins had told her. "So people will believe for the next 100 years or so. Strange how they're exactly aligned with different stars in the constellation of Orion, isn't it?" Tegan considered this. "Why hasn't anyone noticed?" "Because the Earth wobbles slightly on her axis. I don't think the Osirians allowed for that. Probably didn't notice." He looked up from the shelf thoughtfully. "So?" "So, the relative position of the constellation varies over time. The alignment doesn't work now. But when they were built, it was exact. And it will be again in about 21,000 years. "What happens then?" "Oh, I don't know. Street parties, perhaps. Tegan, what can you think of that has a perfectly round base about 3 inches in diameter?" Tegan closed her eyes for a second. "I haven't a clue, Doctor. What?" "I don't know," he said in a hurt voice, and pointed to a barely discernible mark in the dust on the shelf, an area where the dust was slightly thinner. "But whatever it is, it's been removed from its place between the cobra and the jackal." He looked straight at Tegan. "I wonder why," he said. Sadan Rasul stared into the falling sand and recited from the scroll of Thoth. He had chosen a position from which he could direct his words, thoughts, and power directly into the tent. The sand spiraled slowly down in a fine spray, building a perfect pyramid in the lower bowl of the hourglass. As he finished speaking, Rasul set the hourglass down on the ground and watched the tent, waiting to see movement from within. The hourglass balanced at an angle on the desert floor, but Rasul paid it no heed. He knew from experience that it did not matter whether it stood angled, toppled over, or was upended. The sands had been set in their courses, and whatever happened to the outside of the hourglass, they would continue their fall, would continue to pile perfectly on the foundations laid by previous grains, until all the sand has travelled down from one bowl to the other. And then his work would be done, and the waiting would be over. The tiny drops of sand continued to dribble in an almost imperceptible spray. The top bowl was almost empty, perhaps 1/50th of the sand remaining. The pile of sand in the lower bowl continued to build its slow pyramid as Rasool lifted the hourglass and carried it back to his small encampment in the valley below. Beside his footprints was a small impression in the sand, an impression made by the base of the hourglass. It was a perfect circle, about 3 inches in diameter. The evening sessions were getting gradually more enthusiastic. Kenilworth had a practice of gathering the members of his expedition together every evening after dinner to discuss the day's work and exchange views and information. The first few meetings had been rather subdued, overshadowed by the strange events in the passageway and the death of Simmons. The first evening had been mainly taken up with the doctor giving assurances that they were over the worst problems, and he did not anticipate any further automata, as Kenilworth described them, posing more fatal brain teasers. Faced with the task of cataloguing the tomb and its contents, the others did not press the doctor for more information. Tegan could see how relieved he was that they let the matter drop. This evening was the first that Margaret Evans had felt up to joining them. Initially, she had not ventured from her tent, having food and water sent in. The last 2 nights she had dined with the others, quiet and pale. Tonight she seemed to be making an effort to get back into things. Tegan made a point of sitting next to her at one of the trestle tables, and noticed that her father seemed hardly to have noticed her demeanour. She had overheard Evans telling Macready a few days previously that his daughter was suffering from fatigue brought on by loss of sleep. And then some, thought Tegan, who had no illusions about what she had really lost. Perhaps because of Margaret Evans's reappearance, or perhaps because the doctor opened the session by asking who had removed an uncatalogued object from the tomb, the proceedings were more lively than usual. Everyone denied vehemently removing anything, and Evans started again on his pet speech about scrupulous documentation. He moved from this directly into suggesting that the stone cladding of the tomb interior and the carved sections of the corridor be dismantled and stripped so they could be returned to England. Tegan was surprised at the suggestion, and more surprised by the nods that it elicited round the tables. But she was amazed at the doctor's reaction. "You call yourself an archaeologist?" he said, standing up and leaning over the table at Evans. The small man leaned away, obviously unsettled by the sudden outburst. "Have you no idea of the damage done to the past by that sort of action?" the doctor went on. "I suppose you think that the wonders of ancient Egypt will be better displayed in the Victorian splendour of the British Museum than in their rightful place amongst the desert sands." "Well, actually," coughed Evans. But the doctor cut him off. "I don't know. When will you learn?" He looked towards the deep blue of the heavens, pinched the bridge of his nose, closed his eyes, and turned a full circle. "I know," he said more quietly, "that it is common practice to return home with treasures and even the inside of the tombs that have been surveyed. But I have a theory that archaeology can be better appreciated in situ, and if we leave it as undisturbed as possible, then others can make their own assessments with as much evidence as possible." "I take your point, Doctor," Macready agreed, "but given the finances that the British Museum has forwarded—" "Money? Is that what it comes down to?" The doctor waved his hands in frustration. "You'll destroy it, don't you see that?" "It's preservation, surely," Kenilworth interposed. "What? How can you claim such a thing? Even Champollion himself cut the painted royal heads from the walls of the tomb of Amenhotep III so they could be hung in the Bibliothèque Nationale." The doctor paced up and down in front of the group as he spoke, his voice gathering speed until he was breathless in his hurry to finish what he was saying. "Blank squares in the adorned walls of an ancient burial chamber, just so that the rich socialites of Europe can admire the works of civilizations the living descendants of whom they regard with contempt. Kenilworth blinked, but said nothing. Macready shifted uncomfortably on his bench, and Evans stared silently, mouth hanging open. Tegan and Margaret exchanged glances, each showing surprise and varying degrees of embarrassment. "Preservation?" the doctor finished, almost as a whisper. "I don't think so." Kenilworth was the first to break the silence. "Doctor," he said, "I don't think any of us here don't share your enthusiasm for the past and your desire to preserve it." He looked round the others as if to gain their approval and confirmation. "But it seems we may differ in our views about how to achieve this. Speaking for myself, I feel that whatever relics we can remove to the more civilized climes of Great Britain stand a better chance of long-term survival than those left in a country where every pyramid so far discovered has been robbed of its treasures. Every pyramid until this one." The doctor nodded. "I didn't mean to sound as if I doubted your honesty or your motives, and I apologize if that is how it sounded, but—" Kenilworth held up his hand. "But," he finished for the doctor, "you do express some reservations, I think, about tampering with the structure of the find. Forgive me if I misinterpret your words, Doctor, but it seems to me that your primary concern is for the integrity of the architecture." The doctor did not answer immediately. He walked back to his bench and sat down, staring at the top of the table for a while. "I suppose that's true," he said at last. "The artifacts can be redistributed, though it's a shame to break up any collection, provided they are scrupulously catalogued and their whereabouts recorded. But I cannot sanction the removal of one block of stone or one chip of paint from the pyramid." "Is it because it's dangerous?" Tegan was wondering if the doctor was concerned about the Osirian influences in science. "No, Tegan," the doctor shook his head sadly. "It's because it's criminal. We're talking about breaking things that don't belong to us and which can never be replaced." "I am in charge of this expedition," Kenilworth said loudly, standing up and looking in turn at each member of his party. "But it is thanks to the doctor that we are here at all, and probably that we are still alive." He gave a short nod as if in thanks. "So, I think we should do as the doctor asks, and disturb as little as possible. We shall remove relics we believe to be important, and we shall catalogue and document everything, including the minutiae of the structure. But the architecture remains intact. Any questions?" There were none. The session broke up soon after. Macready and Evans wandered off to compare some notes. Atkins and Kenilworth spoke quietly with the doctor. Tegan found herself talking to Margaret Evans. "Is your friend always so forceful?" Margaret asked. "Only when he thinks it's important. Otherwise he varies from indecisive to aloof." They spoke about the progress of the excavations and the catalogue as they made their way back towards their tents on the far side of the encampment. The canvas of the low supply tents bowed and flapped in the quickening desert breeze. "I wonder," Margaret said as they passed another of the small tents, "may I ask you a small favour?" Tegan shrugged. "Depends what it is. Ask away." "Would you wait here a moment?" "Is that it?" Margaret gestured to the nearest tent. "This is where they put poor Nicholas's body. I look at him each day just to check that he is—" She struggled for a word and decided on peaceful. Tegan nodded. "He meant a lot to you, didn't he?" "He had been assistant to my father for a long time." She looked down at the ground, making tiny circles in the sand with the toe of her leather boot. He was always so tense and jittery when I was near him, and now he seems so calm." Tegan crossed her fingers behind her back. "I'm sure he valued your company enormously," she said. "Do you really think so?" Margaret's face lit up, catching the fading sunlight. In that moment, she shed 10 years. Tegan smiled back. "I'll wait here," she said. The scream came almost immediately. The flap of the tent's entrance had barely fallen back into place when Margaret re-emerged, her face white and her eyes wide and streaming. "He's gone," she said between deep rasping sobs. "Nicholas has gone." A general search of the camp revealed nothing. Nebka, under Atkins's supervision, organised the reluctant Egyptian workers to check the tents and the surrounding area, but still they found nothing. Tegan did her best to comfort the distraught Margaret. The doctor seemed to be wandering aimlessly round the camp, his expression getting gradually darker as the evening drew in and faded into night. "It's a mystery and no mistake," Kenilworth said as he called off the search due to bad light. "What do you reckon, Doctor?" "I reckon," the doctor said, "that we should all get a good night's sleep and then do our best to finish here as soon as we can." "Well," Atkins said to the doctor as they parted company on the way to their tents, "one thing's for sure. He didn't go for a little walk." In the darkening chill of the desert night, the doctor's expression was unreadable, and his muttered words were lost in the breeze. The wind whistled through the canvas tents and swished across the sand dunes. It brought comfort to Kenilworth, who was used to the sound and felt almost at home when he could hear the desert. It annoyed Macready, as it seemed to swell just as he was dropping off, jerking him wider awake each time. It was of no consequence to Atkins, who settled down neatly in his pyjamas and went immediately and efficiently to sleep, boots polished and clothes laid out for the next day. It irritated Evans, as he was first concerned about his daughter's demeanour and wondered what could be the cause, and then worried about where he would find a personal secretary as trustworthy as Simmons. The wind blew Rasool's thin cotton clothes about him as he knelt beside the hourglass and watched the reflections of the stars of Orion wrapped about the glass. It wailed its complimentary lamentation through Margaret's tent and punctuated her sobs with its moans. It failed to register his existence with the doctor as he sat cross-legged on the floor of his tent, deep in thought. And it drove Tegan to clasp a pillow over her head and think of her father's farm and the family she had lost. Eventually, she could stand it no longer, and Tegan threw off her covers. She grabbed the cloak she had not believed she would need, but had then discovered had been packed for her anyway. Then she fumbled with the oil lamp on the low table beside her camp bed until it flickered into life. Tegan needed to talk to someone, and her choices were somewhat limited. She was not at all sure she was in the right mood to talk to Margaret. She was certain the doctor was not in the right mood to talk to her. Kenilworth and Atkins would be asleep, and even if they were not, one of them would not understand the emotions she was feeling, while the other would not understand that she was feeling emotions at all. Which left her just one choice, if you could have a single choice. Probably not, she decided, as she realized that she had walked through the camp and was pushing through the canvas cover over the entrance to the pyramid, even as she decided where she was going. No choice at all. The corridor up to the burial chamber was steeper than she remembered. She leaned forward and pulled her cloak tighter with one hand, holding her lamp in front of her with the other. The dim light threw a faint aura in front of her and elongated the cuts of the engraved hieroglyphics. It lingered in the cold of her breath and drew the painted pupils of the Shabti's eyes so the statues seemed to watch her as she passed. When she reached the chamber, Tegan placed the lamp on the shelf at the head of the coffin. It fitted neatly over the circle the doctor had noticed between the relics. "Perhaps I should suggest it was an ancient Egyptian oil lamp," Tegan said quietly to the carved figure on the coffin lid. Nissa's painted, impassive features stared back without comment. "Maybe they had oil lamps," she continued, sitting down with her back to the wall and drawing up her knees. She was looking along the length of the sarcophagus towards the doorway. Her head was probably on a level with Nissa's within the casket. "I hope you don't mind company, but I couldn't sleep. Could have gone to see the doctor, I suppose. I doubt he's asleep, but I don't think he'd understand. The wind sounds just like on the farm. Dad used to say it was there to keep us company, watching over us and keeping us safe. I believed him. I believed everything Dad told me. Well, almost everything. But it's different here. It sounds more spooky, like it's out to get us, not watch us. I can still hear Dad's voice. I can hear him saying, keeping us safe. Isn't that odd? Because I have to really think to remember what he looked like. And when I do remember, it doesn't matter where he is. He always looks like he does in the photo on the kitchen wall. Same expression, same position. Everything. Funny. I hope you don't mind me talking away. It's what I do best. Well, it's what I do most of anyway. Get lots of friends that way. You never talked much. Probably keep lots of friends that way. The picture of you is quite good, by the way. Got the eyes, though the hair's not quite right. I keep thinking you'll push off the lid, sit up and answer me. But I know you won't. I don't know if you can hear, and if you can, I don't know if you'll remember. I'm sorry it's taking so long, but the doctor says we have to do what Blinovich says or something. God, I'm bored. How must you feel? I miss you, Nissa. I can talk to you. I mean to you, not at you. It was the same with Dad. It's not the sudden wrench or loss. You get over that. It's the never again. I can't remember how Dad looked when he was joking, though I could recognise it at once. And now I'll never know. I'll never feel his arms round me and his warmth as he hugged me home at the end of school. He was so warm, so safe. I can feel him now, holding me safe. He listened, always. I was always talking sense when I spoke to Dad. I was always interesting when I spoke to Dad. I was always right when I spoke to Dad, even if he then told me something that was even more right. But never again. It's not that we've lost him, it's worse. He's gone, and he's never coming back. Not ever. Oh God, Nissa, talk to me. I'm sick of what I say and how I say it. I know how everyone else feels. The doctor listens, but only so he can disagree. Though I suppose that's better than nothing. Nothing. Just me, alone in the water trying to find the light. Please talk to me, Nissa. Please. I've forgotten what your voice sounds like. Tegan sat alone in the flickering quiet for a while. Her arm lay across the top of the sarcophagus, her hand stroking gently at the face. Then she pushed herself up, knees braced so that her feet pushed against the floor and her back worked its way up the wall. When her shoulders felt the edge of the shelf behind her, she reached out her arm and pushed herself away from the wall as she stood upright. Her hand pushed against the centre of a hieroglyphic, and she felt it give. Tegan held the lamp up to inspect the damage. Her first thought was that she had pushed through a plaster covering or damaged the paint. She could imagine the doctor's comments if she had. The hieroglyph was a set of small pictures surrounded by an upright oval border. The top symbol was a jagged horizontal line, as if the stone had been cut with crimping shears. Below it was an outlined square with a section of the lower side missing, and below that, a snake. The bottom symbol was a human figure lying on its back. The incomplete square had pushed slightly inwards. Tegan could see the deeper recess between the outline cuts in the stone. She reached out tentatively and pushed slightly in the centre of the square. Sure enough, it moved. She pushed harder, and it moved further inwards. And with a deep grating sound, the whole of that section of the wall moved away with it. Tegan was looking at a huge, hidden doorway. She could see nothing of the room beyond. Shadows seemed to spill out of it. In panic, she pushed at the square again, hoping to be able to prise her fingernails between the stone, and remembering what the doctor had said about razor blades. The square pushed back at her and sprang forward. Tegan took a step backwards, and the heavy door swung shut again. She stared at the wall, holding the oil lamp close to the stonework. But it was impossible to see where the doorway was. Tegan reached out again for the hieroglyph. Then, as her fingers touched it, she snatched her hand away, turned, and left the burial chamber. "Well done, Tegan." The doctor was so enthusiastic that she thought for a second he was being sarcastic. "I knew there had to be more than this than just Nyssa. It makes no sense otherwise." Tegan had not been surprised to find the doctor sitting cross-legged on the floor of his tent, staring at the canvas flap as it blew in the wind. But she had expected less interest in her discovery. At the very least, she had thought he would make some comment about her wandering around the pyramid in the dead of night, but he hadn't even mentioned it. Perhaps, from his perspective, such things were perfectly normal behaviour. Feeling rather more confident, Tegan demonstrated the hidden doorway with a degree of smugness, which the doctor seemed not to notice. In fact, he peered closely at the hieroglyphics and seemed more interested in the symbols than in the area of blackness revealed behind them. "All in good time. Be patient, Tegan," he murmured as she hopped from foot to foot. "So, what does it mean?" Oh, I don't know. Have to think about it for a while. My ancient Egyptian isn't what it was 4,000 years ago." "You mean you can't read it?" The doctor straightened up and whipped off his half-moon spectacles. "Of course I can read it. But you asked me what it means." "Same difference?" He shook his head. "Context is key," he said. "Ask me again when we've looked inside the hidden room." "Why?" The doctor visibly braced himself and made a point of keeping calm. "Egyptian hieroglyphs are not an exact language, Tegan. Their order is important to their meaning, yet the scribes would rearrange them so they looked good rather than meant what was intended. That set of hieroglyphs could be read from top to bottom or from bottom to top, and each way it means something different. It could be that the final symbol in the sequence, whichever that is, gives an overall impression of the word or phrase so as to reiterate and reinforce the thought, or not. Depending on the exact age, the alphabet may have different inflections and meaning." "Not easy, then?" "Not, as you say, easy." He picked up the oil lamp which they had rested on the shelf beside the door. Tegan nodded slowly. "Why's it got a ring round it?" she asked. The doctor glared at her, pushed past, and disappeared into the darkness. "It's a cartouche." His voice floated out of the void. The room was smaller than the chamber they had just left. It was almost completely bare. There was a central dais, and 4 large ornate sarcophagi stood upright, one in each of the corners of the room. The walls were covered in hieroglyphics, stretching up to the ceiling which arched above them. The only breaks were for ventilation shafts, like the ones in the main burial chamber. There was one in each wall, dark openings about 4 inches square. On the raised dais in the centre of the room was a casket. It was a sarcophagus similar to Nyssa's, but the outside was completely devoid of decoration. A matte black oval of polished stone with a thin line of deeper black which marked the point where the lid joined the base. The doctor was already standing beside it, hands in pockets examining the polished lid as Tegan entered the room. "So, what's a cartouche?" she asked as she joined him. He looked up, eyes focusing at a point somewhere behind her head. "Oh, French, coined by Napoleon's team when they arrived in Egypt in 1798. They were the first real Egyptian archaeologists and thought those oval shapes were like their cartridges. Cartouche is French for cartridge, and for carton." A puzzled look swept over his face. Perhaps it was the cartons the cartridges came in they thought they looked like. Language again. Needs a context. "Yes, but what is it, Doctor?" The doctor's face cleared as he answered. "Oh, it's a royal name. The oval represents a loop of rope encircling the name. The loop represents eternity, and if you put your name inside it, you'll live forever." "Will you?" "No, of course not," the doctor admonished. "But they thought they would. And everything's about living forever if you're a pharaoh." He returned his attention to the sarcophagus. "Or an Osiren, come to that." Tegan folded her arms and shifted her weight to her right leg. "You keep going on about these Osirens, Doctor," she said. "Who are they?" "Who were they, rather," the doctor said. "An odd sort from face to Osiris, big on guile and cunning, short on applied morals, though Horus got moving when his uncle started destroying everything for the hell of it. Here, help me lift this back, will you?" He gestured to the coffin lid and took up a position on one side of the casket. Tegan stood opposite him as the doctor counted to 3. Then, together, they heaved the heavy lid back along the sarcophagus. The doctor lifted the oil lamp which he had stood at the base of the dais, and they peered through the narrow opening. "Oh, how boring," the doctor said as the contents were revealed. "It's just another mummy." They pulled the heavy lid back over the coffin. "What were you expecting?" Tegan asked. The doctor shrugged. "Nephthys," he said. "Who?" He exhaled loudly and spoke with exaggerated patience. "The cartouche you found includes the symbol for a door, that square with the section missing. But, being within an oval, it should be a name. If you read it from the top down and assume the horizontal figure is to give some context to the name, then it could read Nephthys." "Was he an Osiren?" "She," the doctor said, "was the sister and wife of Sutekh, and sister of Isis and Osiris, though that's less worrying." Tegan did not reply. The doctor frowned at her lack of response. Nephthys was a goddess and may not have actually existed. Sutekh, her brother according to legend, was an Osiren. He was cornered on Earth by Horus and 740 of his fellow Osirens and imprisoned for all eternity beneath a pyramid. Tegan laughed. "That's all right then." "Till he escaped in 1911, it is. Yes." The doctor waved away her worried expression. "But that's all sorted out now. All ancient Egyptian culture is based on the Osiren history. And I don't know much about an Osiren called Nephthys. But if the Egyptian myths are half true..." His voice tailed off into the darkness. "Yes, if they're right." The doctor turned and stepped down from the dais. "If this time we have to deal with Nephthys, and the myths have a grain of truth in them..." He broke off again, considered, then went on. "If Sutekh had escaped, no power in the universe could have stopped him from wreaking havoc and destruction. This time, it's worse." Tegan considered. The doctor stood in the doorway and surveyed the room. After a moment, he pulled out a notepad and a pencil and started to scribble frantically. "What are you doing?" He did not look up. "I'm copying down the hieroglyphics. I'll make a stab at deciphering some of them later. But before that, I suggest we seal up this room and tell nobody about it." "But why?" "Oh, Tegan, haven't you been listening?" Tegan joined the doctor in the doorway and watched as he scrawled down line after line of symbol with uncanny speed and unerring accuracy. "I thought you'd be getting into the thick of it all," she said. "I mean, it sounds like your sort of thing." Tegan glanced at the nearest of the 4 huge sarcophagi, where it stood upright in the corner by the door. "I never get involved in stuff on this scale. If it is on this scale," the doctor said. Then he caught sight of Tegan's expression. "Well, maybe occasionally," he admitted. "But what's the most important thing at the moment?" Tegan had no doubts. "To save Nyssa." "Exactly." The doctor turned away, and she could not see his expression as he flipped shut his notepad and left the room. "And I will not do anything to jeopardize that." Tegan caught up with the doctor in the burial chamber. He was holding a larger notepad, which she recognized as belonging to Evans. She half remembered seeing it earlier resting on a low table in the chamber. "What are you doing?" The doctor flipped the pad shut and replaced it on the table. "Insurance," he said. "Come on." "What do you mean?" "You were lucky to find the hidden door," the doctor said as they made their way down the corridor towards the desert night. "But the clues are there in the hieroglyphs. We leave tomorrow, but there's always a danger someone will examine Evans's drawings and wonder what the symbols mean. And I don't think it's a good idea for people to poke about in the room we've just seen." "Even if it doesn't have a dead Osiris in it?" "Yes, well, the mummy was human enough. Female, Homo sapiens, circa 5000 BC, but even then..." "So what have you done?" The doctor held aside the canvas doorway for Tegan. "I've corrected Evans's drawing," he said, "so that the doorway and the name of Nephthys don't appear." Atkins ran the final day like a military operation. He had spent the previous evening mapping out an exact timetable for finishing the documentation and providing an inventory of relics to be removed and packed for transport back to Britain. It had been agreeably like planning the details of the servants' duties and listing the shopping requirements for the next day back at Kenilworth House. But without the helpful and agreeable company of Miss Warne. He stood at the entrance to the pyramid, the early evening sun beating down on him, and ticked off the items on a clipboard as the Egyptians removed them. Nebka had agreed his men would enter the corridor, but they would not go so far as to enter the burial chamber itself. Macready, Evans and Kenilworth boxed up the relics, with help from the doctor and Tegan. They worked from a hand-copied version of Atkins's list. Then, Atkins checked the relics were taken to the packing tent. There, Margaret Evans seemed sufficiently recovered to supervise the loading of the boxes into larger packing cases. The packing cases were designed to fit into the panniers of the camels. They were almost finished now, exactly to the schedule which Atkins had suggested. He was satisfied, but not surprised. The last few relics were carried out, and Atkins checked the details written on the box lid, then ticked them off. Jewelled ring on velvet cushion from shelf by sarcophagus in main chamber. He scratched a tick against the same wording on his copy of the list. Snake statuette from shelf by sarcophagus in main chamber. Another tick. Bracelet with scarab beetle motif from shelf by sarcophagus in main chamber. Tick. Stone figure of Anubis from shelf by sarcophagus in main chamber. Atkins looked over his list during the pause before the next relic was brought out. There was only one thing left to be removed, the sarcophagus itself. The sarcophagus and the mummy inside, which only Atkins, the doctor and Tegan knew was the entire reason for the expedition. Atkins wondered vaguely what would happen after they sealed the pyramid that evening and made their way back to London. What would happen when they arrived back at Kenilworth House, and found he was still there. Behind him, the doctor, Kenilworth, Evans and Macready emerged slowly from the doorway. They carried the sarcophagus high on their shoulders. Tegan followed them, head down and face shrouded in shadow. They made their way slowly up the incline towards the packing tent, shuffling slowly through the soft sand like a funeral procession. As they left the pyramid, Nebka and his men pulled shut the door. The night was quiet and still. Two shadowy figures made their way past the snoring lookout and lurched down the shifting slope of sand into the pit where the entrance to the pyramid had been excavated. The door was tightly shut, but the bearers had not yet buried it again in the desert. Rasul reached out and pressed on the side of the door. He knew the exact pressure point, remembered it clearly, just as he remembered the low grating sound as the door swung slowly open. He glanced back towards the rim of the excavations, but nobody came running to investigate the noise. In a moment, the two figures had passed inside, and the door was an empty hole of blackness. They made their way quickly up the corridor, pausing only for Rasul to light his lamp. In the flickering light, the two men surveyed the bare burial chamber, checked the shelf where the relics had stood beside the coffin. Rasul nodded slowly. He had known what he would find. He went over to the wall, scanned the hieroglyphs for a moment, then reached for the centre of the unfinished square in the cartouche of Nephthys's name. Once inside the hidden chamber, Rasul moved to the nearest of the four sarcophagi and pulled aside the heavy lid. It hinged like a door, swinging slowly open in response to Rasul's efforts. He repeated the process with each of the other three. His colleague stood silent and still in the doorway, watching unblinking as Rasul stepped into the centre of the room and raised his hands high above the raised coffin. "Beismei Nephthys," he called out, "Walacha." In each of the open caskets, a figure stirred. As Rasul continued to recite the words of power, the four huge, bandaged figures stretched long, still limbs and stepped forward into the guttering light. Each of the figures was 7 feet tall, heavy legs moving the body stiffly forward, with a rolling motion that transferred the weight of the mummy from one leg to the other as the figure twisted its way forward towards the central dais. The linen-wrapped arms ended in large hands, fingers apparently wrapped together, thumb clamping against them. The chest was a jutting slope of bandage beneath the enormous shoulders. The head seemed perfectly symmetrical under the bindings, flat surfaces pushing back from the middle as if the eyes beneath were huge ovals covering the cheeks. The wind was picking up again outside, amplified and distorted by the corridor, so that it sounded like organ music, rising in pitch and volume as the mummies stopped in front of the dais and Rasul slowly lowered his arms. From the doorway, the pale figure with dark sunken eyes, split skull, and blood-stained clothes nodded slowly. "As it was written," the corpse of Nicholas Simmons rasped. His words sounded as though they were spoken through broken glass. Face to Osiris. The door slammed shut and the side projectors locked on maximum as soon as he was in the capsule. There was no meeting, no discussion, no concession. A trick to lure Osiris into the pyramid and then launch it into space. Osiris looked round the bare interior of the capsule and felt the floor shudder under his feet. It was just an empty shell. There were no sensors, no projection dome, no cytronic particle accelerators. It was a plain pyramid structure powered by a remote psi projection. The mind of Sutek. "A childish stratagem, my brother," Osiris hissed, shaking his jackal head. It was a mere thought to project himself back to face to Osiris. His eyes glowed with the trivial effort, then fled angrily as he felt another mind reach out like a hand and smother his thought in a fist of malevolent mental energy. It was unshaking, constant, and solid. He was trapped. The atmosphere was becoming noticeably thinner. For all his powers, Osiris needed to breathe. He gasped and clawed for air as he considered the options. It could not be happening. Sutek's mental power was projecting the capsule. Great though his powers were, he could not project the capsule through space and cloud Osiris's mind at the same time. He had to have an accomplice. Another Osiren was helping Sutek. But who would dare? Who would risk everything by assisting Sutek the Destroyer, the Lord of Death? As he felt the faint chuckle of laughter in his mind's ear, Osiris knew. He fought to suppress the sound. The walls of the capsule were blurring before his eyes as he struggled to breathe. Isis would come after him, of course, but by then it would be too late. All his sister wife would find would be his body, the mind wrenched from it by death. Unless there was another receptacle close enough for him to project into. He could not break free of the grip enough to project his whole form, but perhaps his mind. Osiris sank to his knees, and the laughter of his sister Nephthys rang unhindered in his head.